Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the National, and welcome to the first time ever wrestling trading cards being featured at the National. We are so thrilled to be here. My name is Paul. I'm from the Wrestling Card Price Guide. I'm here with my associate Tony Vella from WrestlingTradingCards.com. And Tony and I do a monthly show that's called What's Going On in Wrestling Cards. We film it every month. It's available to be watched on WTC TV, which is WrestlingTradingCards.com. So this afternoon, because we have limited time, we're going to talk for about 40 minutes about the past, present, and future of wrestling trading cards, and then we're going to turn it over to you guys if you have any questions, anything like that. Tony and I are going to be talking about the past, and then Chuck and Caleb are going to be talking about the present, and then the Card Foundation brothers are going to be talking about the future. So I'll get cooking. Tony and I are talking about the past, and it's quite easy for us, or it comes naturally to us, because we run two websites that do nothing but archive wrestling cards. So we have complete checklists of everything that's ever been made. So if you're into wrestling cards, you go to WrestlingTradingCards.com or the Wrestling Card Price Guide, and it's all there for you. So we're going to start going back to the earliest days of wrestling cards, and then when we get up to modern day, we'll pass it along to Chuck and Caleb. Tony, let's start with you, and let's talk about the pre-war era.
God, I mean, let's see. Wrestling cards go back to the late 1800s. Yeah. Probably some of the oldest cards that are out there are entertainment and wrestling cards. I know many of you are probably thinking, how old is Hulk Hogan? But it doesn't go that far back. Yeah, so I mean, they're usually mixed in with a lot of entertainment stuff and sports mixed in stuff. So you'll have like fencing and horse riders and things like that, and entertainers. Then you kind of move into the early 1900s with Allen and Genter stuff, and that's pretty much all the pre-war stuff. So really no big star names back then, mostly styles, jiu-jitsu type stuff and things like that. But we didn't really start seeing anything until like the 1950s.
Right. Yeah. And once we're done, once the pre-war ends, we get into what we call the vintage era of wrestling trading cards. And there's some sort of controversy as to when the vintage era starts and ends. I like to think that vintage is pre-1980, but a lot of people think that 1980s are included in vintage, which makes me feel old. But some of the cards from those eras, and
because
again,
you are old.
Yeah, I guess. And this isn't exhaustive at all. We're just picking out some of the past wrestling cards that have come out, been released, that we're really fond of. But in the vintage era, we had a set in the 1950s from a company in Toronto called Parkhurst. That's actually where I'm from, Toronto, Canada. And it was the first dedicated wrestling set that came out. Two sets in 1955 and 1956. There was also, during that era...
Our show will be closing in 1 hour at 6 p.m. tonight.
They're closing in an hour.
Our show will reopen tomorrow morning at
This is so typical for wrestling.
at 9:30 for our VIP early entry passes. And 10 a.m. for our general admission.
Yeah. Dealers!
Get your booth for the 2023 National.
They should have did this in the Mean Gene Okerlund voice.
We're talking over here.
And higher. Select tomorrow morning, beginning at 7:15 in room 202. Again, dealer booth lottery kicks off tomorrow morning. Priority number is 15 and higher.
Big count on this.
Yeah. No, I didn't either.
202.
I can't
Thank you.
I know.
Okay, back to wrestling cards. And one thing I forgot. One thing I forgot to do right off the top is there's a few thank yous in order. First of all, James, that's doing all the AV stuff. Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Dave and Ethan from Ripping Wax that gave us this forum. And probably most important is the organizers themselves. Megan from the National, she was great. We were talking to her forever. And Mr. Dan Burkus, the head man. He was very keen to have us on here, and we thank him for finally letting us talk about wrestling cards. So I was saying about the Parkhurst, there was also some exhibit supply postcards, black and white, in the 1950s. In the 1970s, we had magazine cards. People like to cut out magazines and then have them slabbed. In 1980, we had a set come out with some figures from Japan called Papi Kawijara. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Kajiwara?
Kajiwara. You would know.
Yeah, exactly. We also had in 85, 87 the Tops WWF cards, and then in 1998, you know the Tops, and then in 1998 there was a series put out by a company called Wonderama, which is a huge set of like some 350 cards or something like that. And then Tony's going to now talk about the WCW era in the 1990s.
That's when things really started kicking in for wrestling cards.
Start with the Impels.
Yeah, we can go with the 1991 Impels that people say I'm probably still printing those out of my storage unit, probably. I mean, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a box somewhere, apparently. They're here. I don't think that we really started seeing a real change in wrestling cards until like the late 90s, 98, 99, when WCW was kind of giving WWF a run for its money. And Topps put out 3 really important card sets that came out that time. 1998 Series 1, 1999 Nitro, and Emboss, which included the first time ever on-card autograph cards. Well, I mean, we go back to 94 with the Undertaker and the Savage one, but you're talking 101 pack-pulled autograph cards from so many legends at that time. You had Hogan, and you had Mr. Perfect, and you had Savage, and Elizabeth, and Scott Hall, and Kevin Nash, and you name it. Anybody who was popular at that time had an autograph card, which was amazing to pull that out of packages. Today, that stuff is probably like outside of the 82 All-Stars, pretty much the holy grail of modern wrestling cards, because they've exploded in price. Then you had Comic Images putting out stuff with The Rock. Everybody knows fans of The Rock. I mean, it's a first official autograph card, came out in 98 Superstars. Highly desirable card, very expensive if you can find it. Of course, then he has a couple of cards that are still wrestling related, but you got Scorpion King and Mama Returns he signed for as well. And he hasn't signed cards since, which is incredible. But what else we got? We got Fleer stuff coming up too.
Yeah, so there was a bunch of stuff that came out in between 2001 and 2004. There's 14 sets by a company called Fleer. They're not in business anymore. But some of the highlights of those 14 sets is we had the first Divas set, which was a dedicated women's wrestling set. In 2002, we had the Royal Rumble set, which had a rookie class of Brock Lesnar, Randy Orton, John Cena, and Batista? Yeah. So that's a highly desirable set. And also during that time, we started to see more things like insert cards and autographs. We have the Hurricane Mask and the Farouk knee brace that are very, very rare cards, hard to find. But those are among some of the most popular cards that you're going to find in the past is the Fleer era. And another comparable era, I'm going to give to Tony, is the TriStar TNA era.
Oh, Jesus. The TriStar stuff, I think, is grossly undervalued and underrated. It's they put out some really good stuff that I think is going to start catching on here real soon. The issue with wrestling cards for me, as I've been saying it for the last couple of years since we started doing the podcast, was wrestling has never really gotten the love that it deserves when it comes to collectibles as far as trading cards, because there's not enough zeros behind it like other sports. But that's changing. We're having cards that you could pick up back in the day for $100, $200, seeing $20,000, $30,000, for these cards. That's a huge return, and people are really kind of gravitating towards that era of stuff. And TriStar put out a tremendous amount of great, unique autograph cards, memorabilia cards that you just don't see even in today's product. I kind of wish that some of the manufacturers today would kind of take a little bit of a cue from the old stuff and say, this is some really cool stuff. We should probably bring that back. It's always the same T-shirts and ring mats when people were doing steel chairs and it was just a piece of the table and milk cartons for Kurt Angle and things like that. It was just incredible stuff.
And then from 2006 to 2020, for quite a long stretch, Topps had the WWE license. So we had something like 80 sets or something come out during that time. And some of the highlights of that era, in 2006, we had a product called the Heritage Chrome, which was the first sort of shiny set, which are very popular now, the first metallic treatment on cards. I noted 2010 Top Platinum. I think Chuck would agree that's one of our favorite sets of all time. We find that for people that started to collect rainbows, and parallels, you could do the 5 different colors of cards, and they became very popular. And they had some good, there were some good titles during that time. Undisputed, NXT, Finest, Chrome, Transcendent, which was very, very high end. And then we also had Topps On Demand, the first time we'd have wrestling cards where you can order them online, and then based on what the number of people wanted them, that's what they would actually print. And the last bit that I'll give to Tony is on the Leaf trading cards. Leafs are here, and they've had quite an impact in our hobby as well.
Yeah, Leaf has done some interesting stuff over the years where they've had some actual card sets that are just strictly wrestling, but lately with their Pop Century stuff and other types of releases they put out, they'll always insert some sort of wrestlers in there, be Hogan or Flair, or now it's been Cena in the new 2022 Pop Century. They really do love their wrestlers, and they actually like to put them in there. Their wrestling sets they put out, they were very unique because they were like a lot of Japanese stars that people really didn't know here in the States, in addition to, all your big stars. And some unique combos of autographs. You get a Ric Flair and a Hogan on the same card autographed. You'd get some really unique combinations of signers. And so I hope that Leaf does put something out. I know that we're going to be talking to them sometime soon about some upcoming wrestling card sets, but it's really good stuff they put out.
Okay, so that's our time. We're now going to pass over to Chuck Davey and Caleb, and they're going to talk about what's happened recently, so in the present.
Everybody actually has to go over here with, this is actually Chuckster. We all call him Chuckster. So everybody give some love here to Mr. Chuckster. This guy's been doing archiving. He's the lead archivist for WrestlingTradingCards.com. I couldn't have it to where it is today without this guy.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Paul. As I said, my name's Charles Davey. I'm pretty well known in the wrestling card community as the Chuckster, as they've just pointed out. And again, I am the lead contributor to Tony's WrestlingTradingCard.com, and I'm also a frequent contributor to the Wrestling Card Price Guide with Paul and Ann. And I've been a wrestling card collector for probably about 40 years, so I've seen a lot of stuff come and go. But the one thing I've been asked to speak today on is about the present-day wrestling cards. There's way too many right now to mention tonight. Most of them came from Topps, but there's one set that I would like to focus on. Our hobby in the last couple of years has really seen a lot of growth, and one part of that growth has been Upper Deck entering into the wrestling card hobby. This past year, saw them release the very first AEW card set, also known as All Elite Wrestling, and in my opinion, Upper Deck really knocked this set out of the park. It has some amazing stuff in it. And the buzz around the release in this set was just something I've never seen in the wrestling card hobby before. Everybody was talking about this for almost a year before the release. And I've just never seen this much excitement about a release. Upper Deck also changed the way wrestling cards have been collected in the modern era. In the past, box breaks have always been the key way to get your wrestling cards, but Upper Deck changed that up a little bit because of the high rising prices of hobby boxes. Upper Deck started releasing e-packs on their website, which has really been a big deal in the community. It's really seemed to have taken off. People really like it. They also introduced some really nice new inserts into our hobby that we've never seen before. Most notably, they released what they called shadow box cards, and they released canvas cards, which I don't know why anybody never did that before, because you got wrestling mats and canvas. What goes better hand in hand? That was a really smart marketing move. I love that. Another big change in our hobby in the modern day has been the increase of parallel sets in our hobby. Now, we've always had parallel sets, but Upper Deck has taken it to a whole new level. There are so many parallels out there now. And one of the parallels I'd like to kind of point out and focus on is a really neat cross promotion they did with the action figure collectors. Most action figure collectors just collect action figures, and I'm not sure they're aware of wrestling cards. AEW began inserting these Upper Deck wrestling cards into their packages of action figures. And I think that kind of introduced a lot of new collectors, people who never even knew wrestling cards existed because they were so focused on their figures. And I think that was a fantastic marketing move to create those two together. They also released promo sheets at the New York Comic Con a year or two ago, and they released some promo sheets at Florida AEW Fan Fest this past year, which is promoting their soon-to-be released second set that should be coming out sometime this year. On a final note on these cards and their marketing, AEW actually has begun marketing AEW cards on their weekly programming, which is something I don't think we've ever seen in the hobby before. If it has been done, it's been very few and far between, but they now have graphics on the screen on the lower corner of their programming advertising the cards. They have the announcers talking about the cards. It's just a really great way. I mean, AEW and Upper Deck has worked hand in hand in promoting this, and I think they've just done a marvelous job. Another thing is, wrestling cards has always had a really small but faithful following. And in the past year or two, especially since the pandemic has kicked in and people got into more card collecting, we've seen a big rise in the amount of wrestling collectors we have in our hobby. And it's just really grown, and I know it's going to continue to grow because there's so much good stuff out here now, and we've got all kinds of new companies entering in. Just recently, Upper Deck, and I'm sure you'll hear in a little bit more. We had another company called Panini that has also entered our great hobby. Last thing I kind of want to touch on is our hobby now has also seen the rise of so many wrestling card podcasts. Tony and Paul run one once a month called, tell me what it's called, guys.
It's a real great title. What's going on with wrestling cards?
There you go.
That's my brain idea.
And if you really want to follow and learn more about wrestling cards, Twitter seems to be the place online to go to get information about it, interact with other collectors. So as far as I'm concerned, the present day hobby has just grown in leaps and bounds. It used to be people was kind of embarrassed to say they collected wrestling cards, but not anymore. We've got so many people in this hobby, and it's just taken off. I just really feel like wrestling cards the last year or so has come out of the shadows, and it's only going to continue to grow. The next part of our modern day wrestling card segment, I would like to turn over to Caleb Edkins, who's going to talk a little bit more about the Indy card side of our hobby. Caleb?
Thank you, Chuck. Just to give a little bit of background about myself before I get started with independent cards, my name is Caleb Edkins. I'm from North Carolina, also known as Collecting with Caleb online. And I started out my collecting as a kid, collecting baseball, basketball, football. And then as we moved into kind of the pandemic era of collecting, I found myself priced out of a lot of traditional sports products and started looking for other avenues that I could engage with cards in, and came across wrestling cards. I was a really big wrestling fan when I was little, so I had that big nostalgia factor that I kind of latched onto, and I'm so thankful that I have ended up collecting them because I've met some awesome people along the way doing it. But just to build off what Chuck was talking about, as we were waiting in anticipation for AEW's first set to come out, as hype was really building with Topps Chrome this past year, a lot of people started kind of going down the rabbit hole and trying to get ahead of AEW and figure out, okay, does this person on AEW, say MJF, does MJF have any cards out there that I can collect until this new set comes out? And that's where independent wrestling cards come into play. So before these people were on TV, a lot of them wrestle in independent promotions all across the country, and some of these promotions even put out their own trading card sets. And so this is kind of the way I like to look at it for those of you that collect sports cards, is this is like a Bowman's first card, in my opinion, for these people. This is pre the big leagues, and a lot of times it's their first ever appearance on cardboard. So there's a lot of companies out there like GCW, Limitless, PWG, Ignite Wrestling, Blitzkrieg. All these companies have been really good about putting out card sets, and in the past, I would say probably year and a half, 2 years, they've really started to grow in popularity as people found out not only that they existed, but also how rare they are. Because these are small promotions putting out these sets, they might not always have the biggest budget for their merchandise, so a lot of these cards are very, very low print runs. Some of the biggest print runs when it comes to independent wrestling cards are the All-In set, and that's around 2,000, 2,500 sets, somewhere in that range, which is nothing compared to modern trading cards. And it goes all the way from that, which is kind of like the high number for these cards, all the way down to Limitless Wrestling, which has really gained popularity in the past probably year, I would say, which it's believed that there's 25 to 30 maybe of those sets floating around, and that set has lots of big players in it. That has MJF's rookie year card, it has Darby Allin in there. In the second year of it, it's got Austin Theory's first card ever, so all kinds of incredible talent can be found in these trading card sets. And because there's such a natural rarity to them, this is not something that you can go on eBay and type in and find lots of different choices for. So in a lot of cases, you really have to do some digging to find these cards. But that is something that I personally really enjoyed, and something that drew me to independent wrestling cards, is I had to go on this treasure hunt to find out that the cards even existed in the first place. And then once I realized what I wanted, I had to dig even deeper to find the cards. But this has been something that's given wrestling collectors an opportunity to participate in some prospecting, which you guys may know is very big in sports cards. Lots of people want to buy in early for the young stars, hold them for the future. And correct me if I'm wrong, but wrestling has not always been that way. It's been more so collecting the GOATs, the well-established wrestlers. So this has allowed for wrestling card collectors to have a new way to collect. We've seen some really substantial sales for independent wrestling cards in the past year or so. Since Limitless Wrestling has kind of risen to the forefront, we've seen 4-figure sales for a complete set of that. We've seen multiple $100 sales for later independent wrestling cards of MJF. So as far as this goes, I'm excited about the future of independent wrestling cards and can't wait to see where they take us. And building off that, I'll go ahead and pass it on to the Card Foundation guys to talk about where wrestling cards is going to go.
All right, so where is this all going? So before we get started, my name is Johnny Tancredi. This is my brother Danny Tancredi. We are the Card Foundation podcast, weekly episodic podcast on all the major platforms. Every Thursday we have new episodes, and we really like to talk mostly about what's going on in the modern wrestling card world and what's coming in the future. You know, kind of what to prepare for. Tony's done an amazing job with his material, his podcast and everything, talking about a lot of the vintage stuff. And we kind of pride ourselves on what's going on now and what's coming. So I guess we could start off with really, right now, the main players in the wrestling card world is Upper Deck, who's doing the AEW. They have the AEW exclusive, and Panini, who I know, if you're a card collector, you know who Panini is. They've been around a million years, and they do baseball, they do football, basketball, and now they have the WWE license. So you have these two major companies putting out cards for two competing wrestling federations, and that's kind of where we are in terms of what's going on. And I think a good kind of where we can kick it off is like Prism, because I think Prism coming out this year for wrestling and WWE was something that was just, it kind of changed the game in terms of wrestling cards. We never saw anything like this. So I'll turn it over to Danny.
Yeah, so for Panini Prism, it was kind of monumental for wrestling cards because it drew, obviously, the most eyes on the hobby. So Topps and Topps Chrome and some of the other Topps products, they did a really, really good job of being able to put out great product. But with Panini taking over, you got an influx of newer collectors who are fans of Panini Prism in football, in basketball, and soccer, and all these different sports. So now that it hits wrestling, it takes off. And I think the most important thing to look at right away is boxes come out at $800 a box, and right away, wrestling card collectors are like, whoa, this is kind of new to us because we're used to boxes being at $100, $75, $150 maybe. So for Prism to start out that way and it sells out all over the place, I think it was important for people to recognize, say, hey, wrestling shouldn't be played with. And then boxes over time continue to go $1,000, $1,300. You're seeing some of the most popular breakers in the hobby, they're ripping wrestling. And it's fantastic to see, and with AEW competing with them, on TV every week, it just breeds for not only better wrestling, but for better cards product. So being able to now have AEW and Panini producing great cards, it's great for all of us, because now we could round out our collections with guys from AEW who had independent cards, and now we're getting flagship type cards, and then you got your WWE superstars who now you could collect Topps and Panini. So it just makes collecting overall just better.
Yeah, for the first time, I think we're having wrestlers being compared to some of the other guys in the hobby, like a Joe Burrow, like a Justin Herbert, or a Giannis Antetokounmpo from the NBA. We're seeing, John Cena and The Rock and Roman Reigns sales within Prism that are rivaling some of these cards. We saw a ton of record sales over the last, I'd say, 6 months on the secondary market. Both vintage and this new modern Prism stuff. There was a sale, there were actually two sales this past year, the last couple months, where we saw an Andre the Giant card from 1973 and an Andre the Giant card from 2022 both set records and sell for 5 figures. And honestly, as a wrestling collector, I never really thought we'd get to that point where we'd see a vintage and a modern card from the same exact person reach 5 figures. We struggle just to get to 5 figures for anything. So the fact that we're getting these 5-figure sales and we're getting all this hype on social media and podcasts, it's great for the hobby. Now, Panini is looking forward. You know, Panini's got a bunch of product coming out rest of the year. They have Select, which is going to be a product that a lot of collectors that collect in football and basketball and baseball are used to. We're getting it in WWE for the first time. You know, one big card that I know that's going to come out of that set is going to be Cody Rhodes. Cody Rhodes recently jumped from AEW back to WWE, and now he's getting right into the mix, and he's probably going to be one of the few, if not the first, AEW guy to have an AEW card and a WWE Panini card. So that's something that I know collectors are going to be into, and
Same year.
and
Yeah,
right
same
in the
year.
same year, within a couple months of each other. And aside from Select, I know that they have a couple other products coming out. I know there's a high-end product coming out later on in the year. It wasn't announced yet, I don't believe, but it's probably going to be in like the immaculate kind of reign. So we're gonna see cards in a high-end product that we've never seen before. Relics and on-card autos of wrestlers that just never existed within the hobby. And I know Upper Deck is doing a lot of the same things.
Yeah, Upper Deck is going to be taking over with Spectrum, and then they're releasing their second flagship. So technically, the first one that came out earlier in the year was a 2021 product. We're getting a flagship for 2022 as well. I think this is just great all around. We're seeing even high popularity in wrestling. I mean, we got hundreds of millions of people worldwide watching WrestleMania every year. We got north of 2 million people every week watching AEW, SmackDown, and Raw. So kind of to the point that Johnny made before about just the popularity of wrestling compared to other sports, we're seeing groundbreaking pricing and competing against guys like that. And I think that's important too, because if we continue to get autographs and relics that are selling for $5, $10, $15, I don't think collectors from other worlds are going to take it as serious as they should. So the fact that Prism drops and we're seeing an Ultimate Warrior card sell for $15,000, I mean, that's pretty damn impressive, you know? So the more that it continues to grow, the more that Panini is going to be invested into it. Eventually, one day, Fanatics is going to be invested into it as well when they get the license, and then Upper Deck is going to continue as well. So this competition, the popularity, everybody coming together from, you know, the vintage people to the modern plus future, we're going to continue to do the best we can to promote the hobby and continue to grow it the best we can.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of tools that are being used within the hobby now that are applying to wrestling cards where I don't think they were really being applied, you know, up until this point. You know, we have our own subcategory on Whatnot, which is growing into a massive selling platform within the hobby. You know, up until about, I guess, we got on it maybe a couple months ago, 6-7 months ago, and now there's a wrestling subset. So now if you break wrestling cards on Whatnot, you can actually schedule a show under the wrestling card banner. You can check out an app like Card Ladder. And Wrestling Cards has its own section on Card Ladder where you can actually see what's trending, how far wrestling card sales go back, maybe a month, 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. So we're actually now seeing this data being compiled for wrestling cards in the modern era, which is something that, you know, I mean, especially with wrestling, we just weren't seeing to the same level as a baseball, football, or a basketball. Grading has taken off, and we're seeing a ton of grading come in through wrestling cards. I mean, we're seeing sales now. Vintage wrestling cards are now getting graded, and they're going for a lot of money, and they're kind of rivaling some of those vintage cards in other sports. And we're seeing a lot more with BGS. We're seeing a lot with SGC, so it's not just PSA. I think SGC might even be the biggest at this point with wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten to a point where now wrestling cards trend every week on Wednesday. We call it Wrestling Card Wednesday. And it's companies now taking part of it and posting some of the slabs that they're putting out. It's people like us, and I'm sure many of you in the crowd as well, just posting some of your favorite wrestling cards, whether it be a Roman Reigns auto or a Sasha Banks auto. And the more popular it gets, even amongst those companies, to recognize that wrestling cards are important and there's a ton of collectors out there that want it, again, the better it's just going to end up being for all of us in the long run.
Yeah, and then lastly, to kind of tie everything together, where I think this is truly going is I think we're going to go only up at this point, because like we said before, Panini is putting out a bunch of products throughout this year. They're going to go right into 2023. Upper Deck is the same thing. We've spoken with Upper Deck, and they already have plans for 2023 and beyond with the AEW line. So I think that really the future is within wrestling. There's a lot of room to grow, and I think it's very exciting.
Thanks very much, guys. That was awesome. We're going to turn it over to you now, and if you have any questions. But before we do that, there's just a couple of people we'd like to thank that couldn't be on stage with us that are very instrumental to our hobby. First is Zan Morning, that does a podcast similar to what Tony does, and he's been instrumental in sort of spreading the good word about wrestling. Also, Anthony Havlovic, Husker Hav. He's got a site that sells individual wrestling cards, and I'd be amiss if I didn't throw a shout out to our vintage guys, Rob and Dave. But anyways, if anyone has any questions directed towards any of us, please let us know.
So with Panini, so Fanatics is obviously taking over with, was it 2026, I want to say?
Looks like 26.
So it looks like they're going to have the license up until 2026. Then that's when Fanatics, because the WWE license will go back to Topps, which inherently is Fanatics anyway.
Just to cut in, I think it's important too, because we've discussed this with Panini on our podcast, and they're incredibly passionate about the wrestling product. They have legitimate wrestling fans that are creating the designs, that are figuring out the checklist. I mean, I think we saw it with, if anyone got to rip open Panini Revolution, that was a product that was on the lower end that really anyone didn't think was going to take off. And in terms of popularity, it might have even superseded Prism. So the fact that they're coming out with sets with different tag teams you haven't seen cards in a while and different superstars, you know, it shows how much they care. So from however long Panini has this license, we trust that they're going to do a bang-up job. Well, I think everyone was happy about that except for Kenny Omega being featured. They would have liked to have seen a John Cena or someone like that, but even for a card to come out like that from Leaf to recognize and say, hey, we're putting out 3 legends, even though Kenny Omega might not be a legend, it draws a lot of interest and it draws a lot of attention. So it's the more the merrier in terms of what they could do with dual autos, quad autos, and just wrestling cards in general.
Yes, sir. So the question is, what do we think? In case you didn't hear, the question is, what do we think about the drop that's happened in the last couple of months? Yeah, with Prism. I'll give that one to you, Tony.
Where do I start? People forget when Prism was first announced, the suggested retail price on that was $150 a box. Now we know that's not going to be true, but it jumped like everything else. People who are normally collect Prism are your traditional stick and balls collectors, so they knew I guess it kind of falls in the pump and dump type thing, right?
That was a nice little quote you had there.
Yeah, stick and ball.
Yeah.
Stick and ball.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can edit that out, right? It's just that with that product, it became like the hype was so big that I don't know if it could really sustain that hype for so long. It was good because it actually introduced a bigger spotlight on our hobby, which is really what we wanted, was a bigger spotlight on our hobby, to be taken seriously like other sports. And that's what it did. It did its job. But you have to understand I think they're still printing that stuff because it's just so readily available. People were looking at hobby boxes, then you had blaster boxes. You can order, I mean, it's available everywhere. And we didn't have that before in wrestling where it was available everywhere. And so the market's going to, kind of fall a little bit. And we're also on a downturn in the hobby, in the industry anyways, across the board. I believe everybody's probably suffering from, markets leveling out when it comes to the pricing and stuff like that too. So, wrestling's not going to be different than anybody else. But to see it come this far down, though, I think I just saw some as least low as $350 a box. Honestly, just being honest, I wouldn't be surprised to see it come down to $250, $200.
But I think it's good, though.
I think it is good.
I think it's good for the collectors because, in the beginning it was a little tough for everybody to break that product, and now they can, or at least more people can. And when the box price or the hobby box price comes down, typically the singles will come down. So now people are not, overspending on base rookie cards, and they're going after some of the refractors they can actually afford. They can, play or collect again, and go after a rainbow possibly for maybe a lesser, collected guy because they can now afford to.
That's what got me in it. That's what got me.
Right, and
I would have never. I've always been a Kurt Angle collector, and then I said, I want to try something modern. I'm going to go after Dexter Lumis of all people, but it made it affordable for me to have someone like that and go after a rainbow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So yeah, I think we're all collectors here. So as a collector, I think honestly, it's a good thing.
Just a little touch on. I hate that we're in the breaker section because not to blast any of the breakers, but I think that when Prism came out, it was a pump and dump. And the Prism boys came out, they were able to make a little bit of money, and then from there it's like, well, 50% of your interest in the car just went down. So right away, if no one's going to be breaking it, hobby shops are going to sit there and say, I've been sitting on this product for how long? And then the eBay sales trickle in and it goes to 500, to 4, to 350, and that doesn't do it any favors. But again, I think it's an even better time to now buy and say, hey, I could take a risk on a hobby box, and who knows, maybe you pull a Color Blast, maybe you pull something low numbered, and the collector wins at the end of the day when prices come down a little bit.
Yeah, it affected like set collectors. That Prism really affected set collectors. They were in fear that they couldn't afford to even build a base set. And we have a lot of people in this hobby that are, either they're player collectors or they're just base set collectors, and they thought they couldn't afford it. I think the real one we should have been worried about was Revolution, because Revolution became a really hot product, and in my opinion, it's a better product. And that's a really tough base set to put together because there's less of it printed than there was Prism.
And shout out to the Sports Card Nobody podcast.
Also, another shout out in my thanks. I forgot to thank Nick, the Crazy Card Collector, for filming us today and for helping us out. Any other questions, guys? Yes, sir. Uh-oh. Very good question.
Yeah, very good question.
Very good question.
Who wants to take that?
Well, it's a future thing, guys.
I think there has to be, just because of the name recognition that comes along with both of them. There are people that collect Topps Chrome. There are people that collect Prism. Some people collect both, but there also has their own religious kind of cult following for both of them. Coming from me, I'm a fan of both. I collect Topps Chrome. I love the baseball set that they put out each year. But with Prism, I recognize how big it is within the hobby in terms of its status in basketball and football. So I think there almost has to be both. Maybe one of them is a little bit less of a price point than the other. Maybe they kind of keep one for one section of the hobby and one for the other. But I don't think they should both go away, or one should just take over.
I think on top of that, there's room for multiple types of Prism Chrome kind of stock cards. So, we see it with Topps now as it is with, you'll get, Allen Ginter and then Allen Ginter Chrome, Stadium Club Chrome. So we're getting multiple Chrome style releases throughout the year. Why not have if they keep the Topps name, so to speak, if they ended up buying Panini, Topps Prism, they could make that its own set, and then it just adds to the long line of Topps products that they have. So I hope that they would end up keeping both, because again, both products are fantastic and they kind of offer different things, different type of parallels. And with Panini, if they do like a select style product, you get all the different crazy borders of what is it, snakeskin now, and just all the different stuff that they're doing. So I would take both.
Now, I've always been a set collector all my life, and with the recent rise in popularity and the prices going up on these, I've really had to change the way I collected. I'm never going to give up collecting. They're always going to be in my life. But I really had to change, because as much as I love breaking the boxes, it was also breaking me. So I just decided I was just waiting until it got out there and people were putting together sets, and I was just going after buying the base set anymore and a few insert sets. Although I enjoyed the breaking, I just couldn't do it anymore. But I think there's a market for high end and low end. Get the high end for the really the people who really want to invest in these cards. Get some lower end for some of the newbies that are getting into the hobby, or for the kids who can still afford it and want to go into a store and just pick up a couple packs. So there's room for both in the hobby, but again, for us set collectors, our true set collectors like myself and Paul, we've done it for so many years, and we were always completists. Now we can't be anymore. Number one, because of the price. Number two, because there are so many parallels. We just can't do the collecting the way we like to. So Paul and I have both decided just to go for the base set and the insert sets, and as far as any autos or memorabilia cards, we just kind of, if they come along our way, we come along. But if we get just the basic, we're happy. So, like I said, there's always ways to change your way of collecting, and that's what I've done.
Yep. There we go.
One of the greatest dream matches.
So the question is, will we ever see an Undertaker Sting dual auto card? Since we never got the match, will we see the card?
Well,
One thing I'm going to say
that
before
would
I
be something,
hand it
wouldn't
off, never say never in wrestling.
No.
Because literally everything always happens. So
So that's a definite maybe.
Well, it would probably take someone like a Leaf to do it. You know, with AEW having Sting, with Undertaker being a WWE Legends deal. That's the only holdup is really, I think, more so the Undertaker than it is Sting. Would be incredible. Yeah.
Well, would Fitterman factor into that as well?
right now it would, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they do have the Undertaker and the WWE as part of their lineup. So yeah, for sure.
And Undertaker wasn't signing his rookie cards, his 91 Classic. And that became a huge thing with collectors because they're taking it to, shows and conventions just to have him sign it.
Well, Fitterman is charging $4.99.
Right.
Yeah,
that just changed pretty recently. So at least he's doing it now. But
thanks, guys. So my question is, and I've had this argument, not this discussion with other collectors, is do you feel that the current crop of wrestlers drives products or the legends drive products? Because for me, it's about the legends. I'm all about Macho Man, Undertaker.
Ooh, yeah.
Justifiably in a position.
That's pretty good.
So, for me, when I see a checklist come out and I see it's all modern, I'm like, eh. But like when Revolution came out, and not only did they have Macho Man, because he wasn't in prison, but they had Macho Man, but they also had the Mega Powers. Mm-hmm. So for me, that was a huge selling point. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think it draws on both. Because I think wrestling, the cards itself, with the rise of people like Roman Reigns and Becky Lynch and things like that, and Alexa Bliss, who is arguably the #1 selling female wrestler of all time now. I mean, her stuff consistently sells at high numbers. It's a mix of both. I think having a nice mix of a checklist. I think Prism was a really good one. We all agreed that when it came out, this is a great checklist. And then I think Revolution, like you said, came out and made it even better. So I think it's a mix of both. Guys who like the vintage stuff and guys who like new stuff. It attracts both people. No, I think it helps. I think it at this point, yes. If you want to keep the hobby growing, you're going to have a mixture of both. You got to have both.
Yeah. At least on your big flagship sets, anyways,
Yeah, if you got your flagships,
there's going to be NXT variations and there's going to be smaller versions. But on your flagships and on your names like Select and Revolution and Prism, I think the more extensive this checklist, the better it's going to be for collectors.
If I'm paying $1,000 for a box, it better have a mix of good stuff.
It's funny too, on our show, we do a segment each week where we kind of highlight some of the bigger eBay sales over the last maybe week or so from the last episode. And honestly, each week when we do the research, there's a mixture of both. It's modern stuff, it's vintage stuff, it's vintage wrestlers in a modern setting. We're seeing a little bit of everything. So I think that's kind of where we are.
It's important to know because we didn't even talk about it at all. Like, I see you out there, Brian. He's going, what the hell happened to my Wrestling All-Stars? What? I mean, you have to mention the 1982 Wrestling All-Stars for sure, and 83 All-Stars. I mean, that's comparable to, that's our Mickey Mantle set. That's our Jordan set. That contains early, cards of Hogan and Flair and Andre. It's the big deal for us, and that's what's for vintage. That's what people look at when it comes to vintage, is that set. There's other stuff that's earlier. There's stuff from Japan. There's other things like that. But 82, 83 All-Stars, that's where it's at.
And if you don't include legends in some of the more modern sets, we've got so many younger collectors getting into the hobby that really weren't around when a lot of these guys were in their heyday. And if they get these sets, they're going to go back and
I appreciate it. Thank you.
they're going to go back and they're going to look at these cards and say, well, who is this guy? And they're going to research him. And that's the way you continue wrestling history, is because you got to have both of them in the set. It's great to have modern, but you got to have those vintage so some of the newer people into the hobby can really know wrestling history and know why those cards are important to the hobby.
Yes, sir.
I just had a quick question. I'm coming a little late, but did you touch on anything with the amateur wrestling, like the 72 Gable or any of that kind of stuff, like how that's become mainstream?
That's where I wish we had a Rob England up here, because that's like right up his alley and stuff like that. Not so much in the amateur stuff, but I mean, you get you talk 95, 98 Kurt Angle stuff. That actually does really well. It predates any of his pro wrestling stuff, and that would command some really big money, because when it was short printed, you had to be at the event for the championships to get that, and that's an exception right there.
Also, Gable Stevenson now being in the WWE, that's kind of prompted a lot of the modern guys. He's looked at as one of the top, guys to prospect or rookies right now. But we saw a lot of his stuff go up.
Anybody else?
Good.
All right, folks. Well, thank you very much for listening to us, and enjoy the rest of your show. Thank you.
Come on up. Everybody
We have. Oh, go ahead.
Go for it.
We have some exclusive cards that we made for the event. We'll have them up here if you guys want to come up and grab one. I know Tony's also got some cards too, so.
Oh, you have?
Thank you.
Thank you.
How you guys doing? Danny.